And this brings us up to the inception of the Renaissance. Like I said, it runs from around the 1350s, just after the Black Plague, spreads northward around Europe, peaks around the year 1500, and then fades out to around 1630s, just as modernity is going to make daybreak. Thus, for close to 3 centuries, this movement enjoyed prominence and ranks as a major and permanent cultural shift. For many, the Renaissance means art and architecture. When some of the greatest and the most famous artists flourished, I've already mentioned Raphael. We could mention a whole spate of great artists, Michelangelo, and so forth. And for example, let's just take a look at one great piece of work that has been making news recently. On November the 15th in 2017, the most expensive painting in the history of the world sold for $450 million. It's almost $500 million. Salvatore Mundi, painted by the legendary Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci. We typically most of us think of Renaissance in terms of art or in architecture and so forth. You might see a coffee table book or something like that, some glitzy, magnificent, large book full of wonderful art. But really the Renaissance does not start off as an artistic movement in the visual arts. It starts off as a literary movement. And it starts off trying to recover lost texts from the classical world. Many of these texts were just lying rotting somewhere in some old monastery's library or something like that. And you remember, this is before the age of the printing press. Because these texts would rot away, or a rat might eat them, or anything could happen to them. They might burn or something of that nature, but they just crumble over time. And so texts had to be reproduced over and over and over. Well, sometimes these texts did not get around to being reproduced, and so we've lost so much of the ancient text that existed. For example, we've lost 2/3 of Aristotle's works simply because no one was around to copy them. And so lost to the sands of time. But right around the beginning of the Renaissance, you have a man named Petrarch and his friend Boccaccio, who are inveterate book lovers. These guys really are going to be the ones who give us book culture that we have today and are going to fuel this insatiable desire to recover ancient books. Many of the ancient books that we read in so many of our educational programs, the ones that we read, for example, in History of Ideas programs and classical curriculums and so forth, are books that Petrarch and Boccaccio and his friends recovered and translated into either Latin or some other vernacular language. Some of the Renaissance humanists did not want to translate things into vernacular languages because they thought that the classical Latin was the highest form of language, and so they wanted to only translate it into Latin. For example, Marsilio Ficino, when he translates Plato from Greek into Latin, not Greek into Italian. But nevertheless, the idea here is to recover these ancient works and to make them available to the present age. And as I said, Petrarch is the master of this. He's the leader of this whole movement. So, there are many threads of the Renaissance themes that still run through our daily lives in the humanities and the varieties of the humanism that germinated then. But let's talk about the difference between humanism and humanitarianism. They're not the same thing. Humanitarians are usually humanists, but not all the humanists are humanitarians, if you get my drift here. The word humanism is used in many different ways. Because there were various brands of humanism. For example, we see a different type of humanism in Machiavelli versus Pico, which we'll look at in just a minute when we look at their readings. Okay. So, and then today we have something that you may hear of called secular humanism, which is kind of an atheistic humanism, the idea that human beings looked at from a purely naturalistic viewpoint are infinitely perfectible, that we can perfect ourselves through science, through reason, through medicine, and through better social science and so forth and so on. Okay, so you have to understand that humanism is not just one thing. It is an entire class of different schools of thought. And so usually humanism is going to be fueled by someone's worldview, okay? But humanism fueled in the Renaissance cultivated individualism and the many consequences of individualism. Thus, our current era of intense individualism ultimately will trace all the way back to the Renaissance, okay? While many of us harbor glowing ideas and sentiments about our beloved Renaissance, perhaps inspired by some flamboyant Renaissance fair that we attended at one time or another, the concept of the Renaissance became popular in the 19th century due to a Swiss scholar named Jacob Burckhardt in his seminal work, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. So Burckhardt's work really did kind of gelled for us the whole concept of the Renaissance. He's the one who introduces the word Renaissance to us and helps us engenders for us the understanding that we have today of the Renaissance. And so, you know, that was over 100 years ago. So today, many people look back at this period of time that we call the Renaissance and question, you know, look at it from different points of view and so forth, and question, was there even such a thing as the Renaissance? But it is almost inescapable now. It has become almost solidified within our understanding that there was a time period starting around the 1350s where things began to change, started by Petrarch, and this shift in consciousness. And it does seem as if it is an attempt to resurrect and recover ancient wisdom and replant it at that point, okay? So, Burckhardt's cultural history captures the zeitgeist of the Renaissance and is going to leave us with a kind of permanent understanding of Western civilization's understanding. Okay, so what does the word Renaissance actually mean? It means a rebirthing, okay? And like many movements such as Romanticism or postmodernity, it's very difficult to define. I mean, good luck defining Romanticism or postmodernity because these movements are, it's hard to see when they begin and when they stop. I remember, for example, that I had a great professor of rhetoric and was teaching all kinds of things about postmodernity, and I asked him point blank one day, you know, what is the chief hallmark proposition of postmodernity? And he stopped and looked at the wall for about 30 seconds and he said, I guess he was stumped, but he said, postmodernity does not have a chief hallmark proposition. To which I thought, no, that's the chief hallmark proposition, that there are no chief hallmark propositions, okay? What is the chief hallmark proposition of the Renaissance? It is that the individual can perfect himself. He can create himself, he can make himself, he can better himself through pursuit of classical wisdom. This would be through classical virtues. And that he can, despite all the chaotic institutions that are swirling around him, governments, wars, plagues, corrupt church and political officials and so forth and so on. It was a very chaotic age at that time. Despite all of those changes, you can find a new significance and meaning in life in yourself, okay? And so this is, like I said, the birth of individualism. Okay, so now let's move to the Renaissance thinkers themselves. They intentionally determined to turn history's corner and head in a new direction away from Gothic and medieval culture of the Middle Ages. In fact, they called it the Dark Ages. They were the ones that gave us this concept that these Dark Ages were something that we need to skip over. You know, skip over about 900 years of history and go back and resurrect the classical works and bring them up. Why were those ages so dark? Well, you had a lot of things going on. You had barbarian invasion after barbarian invasion, just almost a dozen of them, including the greatest one of all, which was the Islamic invasions, which really changed the whole map of the ancient world and set Western Europe up in a kind of like a deep freeze. Now, The attitude of these humanists was ad fontes, which means to the sources, okay? Back to the sources of meaning and significance, and away from and skipping over scholasticism and its hair-splitting logic. For example, one of the things that scholastics are often ridiculed for is debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Really, it was just a kind of rhetorical experiment, a rhetorical argumentation. But you get the idea. The scholastics, if you ever do pick up some of this scholastic theology and philosophy and start reading it, your eyes will glaze over very quickly because it becomes incredibly technical. And it became so disconnected from everyday life, from piety, from personal significance, or dealing with all the struggles that people were going through, such as the plague, that Petrarch and his friends decided to leave this vast intellectual movement behind. Okay, so what were some of the things that they preferred? They preferred Latin texts, first of all, Roman texts. The second to that, Greek text, and then after that, Hebrew texts. And so they're trying to find all of these texts, but they really loved the Latin text the most because they held the Latin literature, whether it was history, poetry, politics, they held these Latin texts to be some of the most elegant and eloquent forms of language that existed. Renaissance thinkers conceived of the very concept of the Middle Ages to demarcate this new direction that they went in. They loathed the Dark Ages, which roughly began with the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, all the way up through the Crusades and scholasticism. Dante was the forerunner and emerged in this dark era as a kind of a morning star of the Renaissance. In the 1300 AD, standing at the end of the Middle Ages and at the dawn of a new age, Dante magnificently blended classical culture with Christian culture in his poem Divina Commedia. And it still mesmerizes and challenges people today. Dante sets a tone and a stage for the Italian Renaissance. And Petrarch and Boccaccio determined to recover this lost ancient wisdom and reinvigorate their culture. Again, some of the things that they really struggled with the most were the blows that Italy had received over the many past thousands of years. The Black Plague had left many of them dead. And so Europe was in kind of a zombie apocalyptic state after the Black Plague. And Petrarch had lost many of his friends and his family to the plague. Dejected and empty, he felt that Christianity had ceased to be relevant. After all, this was a time of great turmoil and corruption in the papacy. There was something called the Babylonian captivity of the church, where the papacy was exiled from Rome in Avignon, France. And Rome didn't even have a pope during this time. And scholasticism had ground to a standstill. And after 2 centuries of this long debate, had essentially been destroyed by this new movement of nominalism. Petrarch deeply longed for rich culture, but all around him were the Italian ruins, crumbling fragments of a bygone era of greatness. And breaking from the past 900 years of stagnation with so many calamities, Petrarch aimed to recover classical culture and replant it in the soul of Italy, in his own soul first. But how? How could he do this? He painstakingly collected ancient manuscripts and traveled all around Europe to various monasteries and remote places and recovered these manuscripts and then translated, compiled these ancient works into vernacular languages like Italian or Latin so that many could read them. Now this may sound like it's simple, but it was a momentous task and it was nigh impossible. If you have ever read an ancient book, including your Bible, in your mother tongue, you need to thank the Renaissance humanists. That was their mission. They succeeded, and we all benefit immensely from their work. Within a century of Petrarch's new movement, 2 things happened to put it on steroids. First, the Gutenberg press, the movable printing type press, revolutionized printing making book ownership within the reach of anyone who could read. And of course, the middle class at this time could afford books. Second, in 1453, in the middle of the Quattrocento in the Italian Renaissance, Constantinople fell to the Turks. And so one of the things that happened as Constantinople falls, the Byzantine Empire falls, is that many of those Christian scholars bring their Greek manuscripts with them and they go to Italy. And there that gives the Renaissance humanists a huge influx of fresh texts that they can use for their project. Book translations and printing shot up, and the rising middle class enjoyed an economic boost and spent much of their wealth on education and learning and culture. This rising prosperity, this wealth and social mobility effect fueled the Renaissance.